Welcome to one of the most unsettling stories ever told in Kentucky history. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and the exact time of day or night you've tuned in, because I'm always curious to see when and where these stories reach people. The summer of 1888 in Harlan County was brutally hot, even by Appalachian standards. The valley's trapped heat like a sealed pot pressing heavy against the skin and turning the air into something you could almost taste. It was during this oppressive season that travelers moving along the lonely road between Cumberland and Pineville began to notice strange things about Willow Creek Inn, a modest roadside stop perched beside a slow bend of the Cumberland River, where old willow trees drooped low over the water. The inn had been run by the Blackwood family since 1872, with Thomas and his wife Martha earning a quiet reputation for serving meals so rich and satisfying that people went miles out of their way to dine there. The building itself was simple, a two-story wooden structure with 6 upstairs rooms and a dining hall below. But Thomas had expanded the kitchen twice over the years, and guests swore it was worth the journey for what local papers once called the most savory dishes in eastern Kentucky. Thomas had bought the property in 1871 after marrying Martha in Louisville, transforming what had been a neglected homestead abandoned during the Civil War into a working inn. He was careful in his renovations, particularly with the kitchen and a curious outbuilding that most assumed was a smokehouse. Martha herself was something of a mystery. She gave her maiden name as Wilson from Cincinnati, though no records ever confirmed her past. Neighbors described her as polite but withdrawn a woman who quickly made a name for herself as a remarkable cook. Within months of opening, word of her meals spread through the county. On July 17, 1888, a cattle trader named Elijah Morton stopped there on his way to Louisville. In a later statement to the sheriff, Morton recalled being struck by the smell drifting from the kitchen that evening. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered, not unpleasant, but strangely sweet and heavy, like rendered fat that somehow set his appetite against his instincts. Morton might have dismissed it as nothing more than unusual cooking, if not for what he saw later that night: young Daniel Blackwood, just 14 years old, struggling to carry a large metal container out from the small outbuilding behind the inn. According to records kept by the Cumberland County Historical Society, Morton later described how the boy struggled with the weight of the container. When he paused to readjust his grip, Morton noticed a thick, yellowish liquid seeping from beneath the lid. The boy quickly shifted the cover back into place, glancing nervously around before hurrying toward the kitchen. What unsettled Morton most was not the strange substance itself, but the boy's behavior. Daniel Blackwood, usually remembered as a quiet, bookish child, carried himself with the unease of someone forced into a task he did not understand, but dared not refuse. Morton, a father of 3, noted that the boy's stiff posture and furtive movements reminded him less of a child helping with chores and more of someone burdened with a secret. When Morton later asked about it over supper, Thomas Blackwood's reaction was telling. "Just lard for cooking," he muttered, though Martha's trembling hands betrayed her. She dropped a spoon, splattering the tablecloth with an oddly glossy gravy that shimmered in the lamplight. Thomas quickly steered the conversation away, pressing Morton for details about his cattle route and schedule questions that, in hindsight, seemed less like polite talk and more like a careful assessment of how easily he might vanish without notice. Dinner that evening was served in the inn's cramped dining room alongside 3 other travelers, a young couple on their way to visit relatives in Middlesboro and a furniture salesman from Knoxville named Henry Peterson. The Blackwoods fussed over the couple, refilling their glasses and engaging them in lively chatter, while Morton and Peterson received less attention. The couple declined Martha's special dish, same name us. They preferred something lighter after days on the road. Morton and Peterson, however, accepted the house specialty, a thick stew that Martha claimed was a family recipe handed down for generations. Both men would later remark on its extraordinary flavor. Morton told investigators it was unlike anything he had ever tasted, rich and deeply satisfying, stirring an appetite that felt almost primal. He remembered sopping up the last drops of gravy with bread long after the meat was gone, while Peterson praised Martha repeatedly for her remarkable cooking. What Morton did not realize was that his curiosity had already made him a target. Later that night, he woke to the sound of floorboards creaking outside his room. At first he assumed it was another guest, but when he opened his door, the hallway stood empty, carrying only the faint greasy odor of the stew's strange fat. As he leaned farther out, he glimpsed a large shadow slipping around the corner, a figure he believed to be Thomas Blackwood. Uneasy and unable to rest, Morton made the decision to leave Willow Creek Inn before the sun rose. As Morton readied his wagon in the dark hours before dawn, he caught sight of a faint glow coming from the small outbuilding behind the inn. Curious and uneasy, he stepped closer and peered through a narrow window. Inside, he saw Thomas Blackwood and his eldest son Edward standing over a large metal vat that steamed and bubbled in the lamplight. Morton would later tell authorities that what he witnessed next sent him fleeing in terror, abandoning his belongings without hesitation. Thomas, his sleeves rolled high, stood with his forearms slicked in a glistening substance. Edward carried a bundle wrapped in stained cloth, roughly the size and shape of a man's arm. With deliberate care, he unwrapped it and handed it to his father, who examined the object briefly before lowering it into the churning vat. When the liquid splashed, Morton recognized the same glossy sheen he had seen hours earlier in the gravy on his dinner plate. That realization left no room for doubt. He hitched his wagon in silence and drove through the pre-dawn darkness until he reached Cumberland, where he poured out his story to Sheriff James Holbrook. At first, Holbrook was doubtful. The Blackwoods were respected in the community, Thomas a deacon at church, Martha admired for her cooking. Yet Morton's vivid description and his shaken state were too compelling to ignore. Holbrook dispatched 2 deputies, Samuel Reed and Jacob Collins, to investigate. When they failed to return by the next evening, the sheriff grew alarmed. He summoned reinforcements from Pineville, and 3 days later led a larger group back to the inn. What they found was chilling. The inn was deserted, its kitchen spotless. The Blackwood family and the missing deputies vanished without a trace. But in the outbuilding, investigators uncovered evidence that turned rumor into horror. The vat Morton had seen was still there, scrubbed clean. The stone floor beneath it sloped into a drainage system that emptied into the Cumberland River. Shelves lined the wall, each holding jars, labeled in Martha Blackwood's careful hand. Rendering May, rendering June, rendering July. At first glance, it could have passed for ordinary lard making until Holbrook spotted the implements hanging on the far wall. Knives, cleavers, and hooks, tools of butchery, but crafted with strange modifications. The blades were curved and measured with precision, suited less for livestock and more for disarticulating human joints. The sheriff's suspicions hardened into certainty when a deputy pried up a loose floorboard and found a small, leather-bound book. This journal, later locked away in the Kentucky State Police Museum's restricted collection, was Martha Blackwood's recipe book. Inside were meticulous notes on what she called the special ingredient. Page after page detailed rendering methods, preferred temperatures, and observations on the superior qualities of different victims. The earliest entry from 1873 hinted that the Blackwoods had begun their grisly practices almost as soon as they opened the inn. One chilling passage from 1874 read, "Combining our special ingredient with lard in equal parts creates a superior result. The flavor is enriched, yet subtle enough that no guest can ever guess what makes it so extraordinary. Thomas suggests we save the pure preparation for special occasions." Another entry dated July 1883 stated bluntly, "Young male specimens provide the clearest and finest flavor, particularly those healthy but not hardened by labor. One chilling entry in Martha Blackwood's journal noted the traveler from Ohio last week yielded nearly 12 quarts of excellent quality. We have stored it in the cool cellar beneath the East Room, where the temperature remains steady even in summer heat. County records later revealed that between 1873 and 1888, at least 37 travelers vanished along the 20-mile stretch of road where the Willow Creek Inn operated. At the time, none of these disappearances were tied to the inn. Authorities had blamed them on the dangers of wilderness travel bandits, accidents, exposure, or simply getting lost in the unforgiving terrain. It wasn't until a historical review in 1953 by the Kentucky State Police that a pattern emerged. The majority of those who went missing were solitary men between the ages of 20 and 40 travelers without local connections, companions, or anyone waiting to immediately raise the alarm if they failed to arrive. Local folklore later suggested that the Blackwoods had perfected the grim art of selecting victims who wouldn't be missed, carefully choosing the vulnerable and the unaccounted for. Sheriff Holbrook's report, dated August 12, 1888, concluded that the methodical nature of the disappearances pointed to a coordinated family effort, a system of identifying, luring, and disposing of victims that operated undetected for nearly 15 years. A search of the Blackwoods' private quarters confirmed the suspicion. Beneath the floor of the master bedroom, deputies uncovered a hidden compartment packed with the personal effects of lost travelers, pocket watches, wallets, correspondence, and in one heartbreaking discovery, a daguerreotype of a young woman holding an infant with the inscription, "To my beloved William, hurry home to us." Interviews with former guests soon revealed an even more disturbing pattern. Not everyone who dined at the Willow Creek Inn was served the infamous house specialty. Locals and regular patrons were usually offered plain familiar fare, while strangers, particularly those who mentioned traveling alone or not being expected elsewhere, were encouraged to try Martha's prized dishes. The inn's guest book, recovered from the front hall, overflowed with glowing praise. One entry, dated March 1887, signed by a merchant named Harold Pierce, read, "I have dined in establishments from Boston to New Orleans. Yet never have I tasted flavors so distinct and satisfying as those in Mrs. Blackwood's kitchen. There is a depth to her cooking that defies description, something that touches a man's very instincts and lingers in memory." Another entry, signed only J.H. from Richmond, in April 1888, declared, "Arrived exhausted, departed rejuvenated." Mrs. Blackwood's cooking seems to contain some vital essence that restores both energy and spirit. One guestbook entry, signed in the spring of 1888, summed up the appeal of the inn with unsettling irony. "I shall certainly make this establishment a regular stop in my travels." What made the Willow Creek case so deeply disturbing was not just the horror of what the Blackwoods had been doing, but how long they had carried on without raising suspicion. Thomas Blackwood was remembered in county records as a soft-spoken, respectable innkeeper and a trusted deacon at Cumberland Baptist Church. Martha donated pies to church fundraisers, cooked meals for struggling families, and was admired for her generosity. Their children, Edward, Catherine, and Daniel, attended the local school and were described by their teacher, Miss Sarah Thornton, as polite, if a little withdrawn. To the outside world, they seemed the very picture of ordinary respectability. Yet, inside the walls of the inn, a different story unfolded. Journal entries discovered in 16-year-old Catherine Blackwood's room revealed a chilling indoctrination. In neat handwriting, she recorded the rules her father had drilled into them. We must always appear ordinary. We must speak kindly to all, help our neighbors when they are in need, and never draw attention to our true purpose. The work is sacred, he says, and must remain our secret alone. Early pages are filled with fear and doubt. She wrote of nightmares of questioning whether what they were doing was wrong. But by 1887, her tone had shifted. "I helped Mother prepare a new batch today," she noted in April of that year. The rendering process is fascinating, how something so ordinary can be transformed into something essential to our livelihood. Mother says, "I have a natural talent for identifying the best quality." Father seemed proud. Her responsibilities grew. In October 1887, she wrote, "Father says I have the best eye for selecting suitable guests. Edward complains that I always choose the easiest ones to manage, but that's the point. We need those who won't cause difficulties. The drummer who arrived today seems perfect. No family waiting, no urgent appointments, and he ate 2 full plates of Mother's stew without suspecting a thing." The most chilling words came in her final entry dated July 14th, 1888, just 3 days before Elijah Morton's fateful stop. "Mother says we may need to relocate soon. Too many questions lately about travelers who didn't arrive where they were expected. Father has been preparing for this possibility for years. I will miss this place, but Mother promises our new home will allow us to continue the work without interruption. The special ingredient she reminded me is what binds us as a family. Without it, we would be like everyone else, ordinary, forgettable, and insignificant." When the Blackwoods vanished, authorities launched a massive search of the property. Behind the inn, investigators uncovered a stretch of earth that looked as if it had been turned over again and again for years. Digging revealed fragments of bone, though far fewer than expected. This led to speculation that the family had used the nearby Cumberland River or the labyrinth of limestone caves beneath the valley to conceal evidence. In September 1888, a deeper excavation exposed the truth. Beneath the disturbed soil, deputies discovered a narrow shaft descending 30 feet into a natural cavern. Inside, they found lantern oil residue excavation tools and the remains of countless victims. The bones bore unmistakable signs of processing: long bones, cracked open for marrow surfaces, scraped clean of tissue, every fragment bearing the marks of a butcher's hand. Meanwhile, bank records painted a picture of deliberate planning. For at least 5 years, Thomas Blackwood had quietly transferred small sums to an account in Cincinnati, suggesting that the family had been preparing for their escape long before Morton stumbled upon their secret. 3 days before Elijah Morton's fateful visit, Thomas Blackwood quietly emptied the family's bank account. The withdrawal, when adjusted for inflation, was worth nearly $50,000 today. Interviews with the station master at the Cumberland Railway Depot revealed that Martha and her daughter Catherine had made 2 extended trips to Cincinnati in the past year, explaining them as shopping excursions. Yet during their last stay in May of 1888, they remained in the city for nearly 2 weeks. Investigators later suspected those trips were not for shopping at all, but to establish new identities and secure passage out of the country. By October of that year, a report surfaced of a family matching the Blackwoods' description, boarding a steamship in New Orleans bound for Central America. By the time the information reached Kentucky law enforcement, the trail had gone cold. Despite international correspondence, the Blackwoods were never seen again. What lingered instead was the devastating psychological impact on the community, especially on those who realized they had dined at Willow Creek Inn. According to the records of Dr. William Hayes, the county physician, several former patrons developed severe psychological disturbances once the truth was revealed. 2 men in particular embodied the horror of that knowledge. Joseph Miller, a farmer who often stopped at the inn during livestock drives, suffered a complete mental collapse. He was committed to the Eastern Kentucky Asylum in Lexington, where, according to medical archives, he refused to eat until his death 3 months later. Hayes's notes describe Miller's condition in stark detail. Patient exhibits extreme agitation when presented with food. He insists he knows what is in it, claims he can still taste them, and refuses to be persuaded otherwise. He states that all food now contains the Blackwood ingredient, and that he would rather starve than consume human essence again. The second man, a carrier named Tobias Fletcher, developed what Hayes described as a morbid obsession with food. Fletcher, who had eaten at Willow Creek nearly twice a month, began dissecting every meal with surgical precision, examining each bite before daring to taste. He lost almost 40 pounds in the months following the revelation and eventually abandoned his trade altogether. Retreating into a cabin outside Pineville, Fletcher survived mostly on vegetables. He grew himself, refusing anything prepared by others. Meanwhile, the Willow Creek Inn itself became an object of grim fascination. Despite officials' efforts to suppress details of the investigation, word spread quickly across Kentucky and beyond. By autumn, curiosity seekers were traveling from neighboring states just to see the site of the infamous inn. County authorities, overwhelmed by the influx, were forced to post guards for several weeks to keep crowds away from the blood-soaked ruin that had once been the Blackwood family's home. In the years following the Blackwoods' disappearance, the ruins of Willow Creek Inn became a source of both fear and fascination. Local children dared one another to approach the abandoned property after dark, whispering stories of strange sounds drifting from the empty buildings, unsettling clatters, faint humming like a woman at work in her kitchen, and most chillingly, the smell of food cooking on moonlit nights. A folklore collector writing in 1905 recorded these tales, noting how persistent they remained in local memory. By November 1888, under orders from the county commissioner, the inn and its outbuildings were burned to the ground, the act officially described as necessary for both public health and public morality. Yet even scorched earth carried the weight of the Blackwoods' crimes. Residents refused to set foot on the land for decades. Efforts to redevelop the property in the early 1900s ended abruptly, when workers reported eerie encounters, tools vanishing without explanation. Sudden drops of temperature, and one surveyor who swore that an elderly woman offered him tea inside the abandoned house only for her and the building itself to vanish when he looked again. The tale of Willow Creek might have slipped into obscurity if not for Professor Emmett Richardson of the University of Kentucky. In 1952, Richardson began researching unusual crimes from the region, and his meticulous work brought the case back into the public eye. Richardson uncovered a detail that added new weight to the legend. Records from the Cumberland Baptist Church noted that Thomas Blackwood had spent 2 years apprenticed to a Louisville butcher before returning to Harlan County to open his inn. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. But Richardson traced local newspapers from 1868 and 1869, where 3 disappearances were reported near that same butcher shop. No connection had been made at the time, yet the pattern was strikingly similar to what would unfold years later along the road by Willow Creek. Richardson also interviewed elderly residents who carried unsettling memories of the Blackwoods. One, Eleanor Winters, the daughter of the butcher, who had once employed Thomas, recalled how unusually fascinated he had been with the rendering process. He would stand for hours watching the fat melt down in the vats, she told Richardson. Father thought it was dedication, but looking back, there was something obsessive in the way he studied it. Perhaps most haunting was the testimony of Abigail Turner, who had briefly worked as a kitchen assistant at Willow Creek Inn in 1877. Turner, 92 years old when Richardson spoke with her in 1953, said she left after just 2 weeks because of what she called unnatural practices. She explained that Martha Blackwood had a storage room she was never permitted to enter. One evening, while the family was occupied with guests, Turner slipped inside. What I saw were containers, dozens of them, she said. They looked like they were filled with lard, but the smell wasn't right. It turned my stomach. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to leave. Turner quit that very night, but Martha pursued her for months, sending letters offering higher pay if she would return. Eventually, Martha came to Turner's home in Cumberland herself, bringing a pie as a gift. She said it was made with her special recipe, Turner recalled, shuddering even decades later. Turner later recalled that she accepted Martha's pie out of politeness, but buried it in her garden as soon as she left. By morning, a stray dog had dug it up and eaten part of it. The animal was dead before sundown, frothing at the mouth and twisting in agony in Turner's yard. That's when I knew for certain she said that there was something wrong with Martha Blackwood's cooking. Her testimony suggested that suspicion had surrounded the Blackwoods long before their secrets were unearthed, yet no action had ever been taken. This failure of recognition became a central theme in Professor Richardson's research. In his papers now preserved at the University of Kentucky archives, he wrote, "The most disturbing aspect of the Willow Creek case is not the depravity of the Blackwood family, but rather the collective blindness that allowed their activities to continue unimpeded for so many years. The question is not simply how the Blackwoods could commit such acts, but how an entire community could fail to see what was happening before their eyes." Through interviews with former residents, Richardson pieced together a troubling pattern. People had noticed strange details, but dismissed them. A stable hand remembered horses balking at the gates, refusing to approach the property. A delivery boy recalled never being allowed inside the kitchen or outbuilding, with Martha always greeting him at the door, rain or shine. A neighbor spoke of lights burning in the outbuilding well past midnight. None of these details in isolation seemed alarming. But taken together, Richardson argued they revealed a pattern of secrecy that should have been impossible to ignore. The family's carefully constructed facade, church attendance, generosity to neighbors, polite and studious children, made it unthinkable that such respectable people could harbor such darkness. Respectability became their shield, and the community's unwillingness to question it allowed the horror to persist. Richardson's work came to a sudden and unsettling end in 1956. He suffered a fatal heart attack while conducting interviews in Cumberland. His notes, which reportedly included leads on a possible Blackwood sighting in Guatemala, were sent to his office at the university, but disappeared before colleagues could examine them. That same week, a small fire broke out in the History Department archives. Officially, the damage was described as minimal. Yet Richardson's files were among the missing. Colleagues later admitted the professor had grown increasingly paranoid in his final weeks. He claimed to have received anonymous letters warning him to stop his research. He believed he was being followed during trips to eastern Kentucky, and twice reported break-ins at his office where nothing appeared stolen. At the time, these fears were attributed to exhaustion and stress. But in hindsight, some have wondered if Richardson had indeed uncovered evidence that the Blackwoods or their descendants were still alive. The story did not end with him. In 1968, during construction of a highway expansion near the former site of the inn, workers unearthed a sealed well. Inside were the remains of at least 7 people. Forensic science of the era could offer little more than confirmation that the bones bore signs of cutting and processing. The discovery reignited public fascination, and whispers spread once again that the Blackwoods' crimes had been far more extensive than anyone dared admit. Carbon dating placed the remains found in the sealed well between 1875 and 1885. The very height of the Blackwoods operation. But what truly horrified investigators was not just the age of the bones, but their condition. The medical examiner's report described each skeleton as having been expertly disarticulated. Clean, deliberate cuts marked every major joint and entire portions of the bodies. Those with the richest fat deposits in life were missing. Dr. Malcolm Jenkins, the forensic anthropologist who examined the remains, wrote, "The methodical nature of the processing suggests someone with significant anatomical knowledge and considerable experience in butchery techniques. The consistency of the cut patterns across all specimens indicates a standardized procedure refined over time. Of particular note is the careful extraction of marrow from larger bones, suggesting that no potentially useful material was wasted. Among the bones were small but damning artifacts. A belt buckle matching one described in a missing salesman's effects. A gold tooth documented in another disappearance, and most definitively a pocket watch engraved with the name Henry Peterson, the furniture salesman, who had shared a table with Elijah Morton on that pivotal July evening in 1888. The investigation that followed was brief and ultimately inconclusive. With the primary suspects long vanished and most first-hand witnesses dead, authorities formally closed the case in 1968, classifying it as a historical crime beyond the reach of modern justice. Yet the legacy of the Willow Creek Inn refused to fade. In Kentucky folklore, the phrase Blackwood hospitality became shorthand for hidden malice, a polite mask concealing monstrous intent. The land where the inn once stood remains undeveloped to this day. Property records show it has changed hands repeatedly over the decades, with no owner able to hold it for more than a few years before abandoning or selling it. In 1962, a descendant of Sheriff James Holbrook donated his great-grandfather's journal to the Kentucky Historical Society. Among its entries were details never included in official reports, including an account of Holbrook's own meal at the Willow Creek Inn just 2 months before its exposure as a slaughterhouse. "I find myself unable to sleep tonight," he wrote on June 5, 1888. "Not from any disturbance, but from the memory of the meal I consumed at Blackwood's establishment this afternoon. There was a richness to the stew I cannot put out of my mind." Martha Blackwood, when complimented, merely smiled and said it was her special recipe reserved for those she considers distinguished guests. I left feeling strangely honored, though I now wonder about the 2 travelers who arrived as I was leaving, young men with no companions, and from their conversation, no particular destination or schedule. A later entry dated August 20th, 1888, after the Blackwoods' crimes had been revealed, records Holbrook's horror at his unwitting participation. "I cannot reconcile myself to what I now know I consumed at that table. The thought of it induces a sickness that no medicine can cure. I find myself wondering whose essence now resides within my body, what poor soul's rendering has become part of my own flesh. There is no cleansing from such a violation, no absolution possible. I have given instructions that upon my death my body is to be cremated rather than buried. I cannot bear the thought of perpetuating this cycle of consumption even in the grave." Holbrook's private admission suggested a chilling truth. Even the county's top lawman had unknowingly eaten the Blackwoods' horrific specialty. It raised a larger, unanswerable question. Just how many people had consumed human remains at the Willow Creek Inn during its 15 years of operation, based on the guest register and Martha Blackwood's meticulous kitchen notes? Investigators estimated that as many as 500 individuals may have been served her special recipe. Most of them went on with their lives, never realizing what they had tasted. Nearly 80 years later, in 1967, the case stirred again. A retired Cincinnati banker contacted Kentucky authorities with a story that had haunted him for decades. He recalled that in 1913, when he was a young teller, he had been present as an elderly woman came in to close a dormant account. The account, originally opened under the name Martha Wilson, was closed with a signature that read, "Martha Blackwood." The banker, then 19 years old, had recognized the name instantly from Kentucky folklore. She was a small woman, very proper, he told investigators. Her hair was silver-pinned neatly, her hands worn from years of work. She looked like anyone's grandmother. But there was a coldness in her eyes, something that didn't belong. As she collected the funds, she mentioned returning to Guatemala, where she said her daughter had established a small hotel serving traditional American cuisine. She even invited him to visit, smiling, as if extending an act of kindness. I remember feeling a chill, despite the summer heat, he said. Intimidated and unsure, the young banker told only his supervisor, who dismissed it as coincidence. For the rest of his life, he wondered if he should have done more. The Kentucky State Police investigated his lead, coordinating with Guatemalan officials. Their inquiries uncovered the remnants of an establishment near Lake Atitlan, known locally as La Posada Americana. Villagers remembered it vividly, even though it had been abandoned since the early 1940s. According to their accounts, the inn had been founded around 1890 by an American couple and their 2 adult children, a son and a daughter. The family became known for their extraordinary food. People would travel for days to eat there, one elderly villager recalled. It was unlike anything else in the region, but the story darkened quickly. Travelers occasionally went missing near Lake Atitlan, their disappearances whispered about, but never fully explained. The expatriate family left suddenly without warning after what locals described only as a troubling incident with guests who did not return. The villagers never saw them again. Villagers near Lake Atitlan remembered the American family well. Their inn, La Posada Americana, was famous for serving dishes unlike anything in Guatemala, rich, sustaining meals that locals said could keep a traveler satisfied for days. But the kitchen was strictly off limits. No local staff were ever permitted to help, and the American woman guarded her recipes with fierce secrecy. As one villager, who had been a boy at the time, recalled, travelers would sometimes vanish. The Americans explained they had left early or taken another route, but over the years, the pattern became too clear. People without families. People alone, they sometimes never came out again. Eventually, even the allure of the food could not outweigh the unease, and the inn fell into decline. In 1968, the site was excavated. The official report, sparse and carefully worded, noted evidence consistent with the practices documented at Willow Creek Inn. But before investigators could pursue it further, tragedy struck. 2 Kentucky State Police detectives vanished while traveling from Guatemala City to the excavation site. Their vehicle was later recovered empty on a mountain road. Local officials attributed the disappearance to bandits, though no similar incidents were reported in the area that year. A 3rd investigator, who had stayed behind in Guatemala City, received a package the following night. Inside was a single recipe card headed "Grandmother's Special Recipe." The handwriting, compared later to Martha Blackwood's journals, matched almost perfectly, despite nearly 80 years having passed since her disappearance. The file was sealed in 1969, locked away in the Kentucky State Police Restricted Archives, where it remains to this day. Only a handful of researchers and law enforcement officials have ever been granted access. What makes the Willow Creek Inn case endure is not only the grotesque crimes committed there, but the unsettling questions it forces us to confront. How could an entire family maintain such a horrifying double life? Their outward kindness masking unthinkable cruelty. How could a community fail to notice or perhaps refuse to see the predators in their midst? And how many unwitting people seated at the Blackwoods table became part of their legacy without ever knowing? The Blackwoods were not drifters, not outsiders. They were respected members of their church, generous neighbors and parents whose children were described as polite and well-mannered. They embodied the very image of respectability. That more than anything is what makes the case so disturbing, the realization that true evil can hide in plain sight, smiling, as it welcomes you, offering a meal prepared with what Martha once described in her final recipe entry as the ingredient that makes everything taste of life itself. The psychological impact lingered long after the family vanished. In the months following the revelations, newspapers reported a steep decline in business at inns and restaurants across Harlan County. Travelers, once eager for a warm meal, now carried their own provisions, unwilling to risk becoming someone else's supper. The shadow of Willow Creek stretched far beyond Kentucky's borders, settling into American folklore as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem the most ordinary. In the aftermath of the Blackwood revelations, the ripple effects across Harlan County were profound. Innkeepers desperate to rebuild trust began preparing meals in full view of their guests. Travelers insisted on watching every step of the cooking process, from the raw ingredients to the final serving. Dr. Elias Vittman, a Cumberland physician, practicing between 1885 and 1902, recorded what he called Blackwood anxiety in his medical journals. Patients developed elaborate food rituals, refusing to eat anything they hadn't personally witnessed being prepared. Some grew so distrustful they wasted away, unable to bring themselves to eat meals, even cooked by their own families. Vittman wrote, "The most profound damage inflicted by the Blackwoods may not be the harm to their direct victims, but the poison of suspicion they left behind. When the trust between host and guest is destroyed, the social fabric itself begins to unravel." And unravel it did. Community suppers, once the heart of local life, fell into decline. Parents forbade their children from wandering or accepting food outside the home. Even surnames that resembled Blackwood became stigmatized, with families quietly changing their names or relocating to escape the shadow of association. The toll on the families of Samuel Reed and Jacob Collins, the deputies who vanished during the first investigation, was equally devastating. County records note that Reed's widow suffered a mental collapse upon learning the likely fate of her husband and spent months institutionalized. Collins's elderly parents died within weeks of each other, after the connection was made public, their doctor attributing their deaths to shock and grief. As years passed, the Willow Creek Inn shifted from a crime story to a cautionary tale. Parents warned children against straying too far or accepting food from strangers by invoking the Blackwood kitchen. By the early 1900s, the story had sprouted supernatural embellishments absent from any historical record claims that Martha Blackwood could hypnotize victims with a glance, or that the family possessed a forbidden cookbook filled with unholy recipes. Folklorists studying these stories in the mid-20th century noted how the Blackwoods had been recast as boogeymen, their legend warped into myth to soften the unbearable truth. As one researcher observed in 1957, by adding impossible elements to the Blackwood narrative, the community creates distance from the more disturbing reality that the monsters were ordinary people who lived among them undetected for years. The site itself remained a magnet for morbid fascination. Though the inn and outbuildings were long since destroyed, locals swore the clearing retained an unnatural stillness. Birds fell silent, animals skirted the perimeter, and hunters reported that game avoided the grounds entirely. To this day, the place where the Willow Creek Inn once stood is remembered not just as a ruin of wood and stone, but as a wound carved deep into the memory of Kentucky. Attempts to reclaim the land where the Willow Creek Inn once stood were plagued with failure. In the early 20th century, construction projects faltered amid accidents, broken equipment, and workers who refused to stay after reporting the unnerving sense of being watched. In 1927, a Louisville businessman, Lawrence Harrington, purchased the property with plans for a hunting lodge. Construction began in April, but within weeks, workers unearthed human remains while digging the foundation. Harrington halted the project, sold the land at a loss, and never spoke of it again. The clearing remained untouched until 1955, when the state of Kentucky acquired it for a planned highway expansion. It was during the preliminary surveys that Professor Emmett Richardson conducted what would be his final research before his sudden death. The highway was later rerouted officially for terrain reasons, though locals whispered that crews refused to push the road through cursed ground. Today, the site remains an empty scar in the forest, avoided after dark by locals who still claim to catch the faint whiff of something sweet and fatty on still summer nights. As for the Blackwoods themselves, their ultimate fate remains a mystery. If the Guatemalan accounts are to be believed, the family continued their grisly work for decades after leaving Kentucky. No death records exist for any of them. The last confirmed trace came from a 1943 passenger manifest listing a Catherine Black, age 71, traveling with her granddaughter Maria, age 26, bound for Mendoza, Argentina. Their declared occupation restaurant proprietors. The following year, records show a restaurant called La Cocina Americana opening in Mendoza, owned by a widow and her granddaughter. They became known for their traditional recipes, dishes so distinctive that they earned local fame. But in 1967, the restaurant closed abruptly after several vineyard workers disappeared last seen dining there. When investigators arrived, they found the kitchen intact, but no sign of the owners who had vanished without a trace. Maria, if she survived, would now be in her 80s. Rumors still surface from time to time of a small exclusive restaurant somewhere in South America, run by an elderly woman who serves a family recipe only to carefully chosen guests. None of these reports have ever been verified. In the words of Professor Richardson, who dedicated and perhaps lost his life to unraveling the truth, some mysteries are not meant to be solved, but to serve as warnings. The Willow Creek Inn is more than a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that evil often wears ordinary faces, that the warmest hospitality can conceal the darkest intentions, and that sometimes the most dangerous invitation is the simplest one, an offer to join the table. The Blackwood case has continued to fascinate criminologists and psychiatrists alike. Dr. Eleanor Voss, a forensic psychiatrist writing in the 1960s, argued that the family embodied a unique form of shared psychopathy, a closed system of belief in which horrific acts were rationalized as sacred purpose. Within their home, atrocity became routine. To the outside world, they remained polite neighbors, helpful parishioners, and generous hosts. And that is what continues to chill us more than a century later, not simply the horror of what was done, but the realization of who did it, ordinary people who beneath their smiles carried a recipe for madness. What makes the Blackwoods so unusual in the history of criminal psychology? Dr. Eleanor Voss observed in her 1967 study was not merely the brutality of their crimes, but the complete integration of their children into the family practice. In most criminal households, children are either shielded from illicit activities or become reluctant participants. With the Blackwoods, however, the conditioning appears deliberate, systematic, and framed as a kind of sacred knowledge passed from parent to child. This process is laid bare in the journal of Catherine Blackwood. Her early entries revealed doubt and moral conflict. But by 1888, her writing demonstrates what Voss termed inverted moral reasoning, a worldview in which their crimes were not seen as transgressions, but as proof of superiority. In one passage, Catherine wrote, "The people who pass through are just walking vessels of ingredients. They don't understand their purpose as we do." Mother says that by incorporating them into our food, we honor them in a way they could never appreciate in life. This reframing transformed murder into ritual predation, into craftsmanship and secrecy, into sacred duty. For the children, it provided cohesion and a sense of chosen status, making it far easier to compartmentalize their public identities as respectable neighbors from their private reality as predators. While comparisons are often made to figures like Albert Fish in the 1920s, or to the enduring legend of Sweeney Todd, the Blackwoods case stands apart. Their crimes were not isolated acts of sadism, nor the creation of folklore, but a methodical, multi-generational operation. The structure of their family unit and the culinary framework they developed to justify their actions make the Willow Creek case unique in both scope and psychological depth. The origins of their practices remain uncertain. Thomas Blackwood's life before his apprenticeship in Louisville is sparsely documented. Church records suggest he was orphaned and raised by a great-aunt in Virginia. But researchers found no conclusive evidence of his early years. Some have speculated that Martha was the true architect of their system. Her mysterious background, combined with the centrality of her cooking, places her influence at the heart of the family's legacy. Without more information about her early life, however, such theories remain speculative. What is undeniable is the Blackwoods' obsession with craft. Martha's recipe book, now preserved under restricted access, reveals a language not of violence, but of culinary mastery. In an 1882 entry, she wrote, "The difference between mediocrity and mastery lies in attention to detail. Anyone can render fat, but achieving perfect clarity, the ideal balance of flavor that requires skill and the finest ingredients. Our reputation depends on maintaining the highest standards in selection, processing, and preparation." Here was the perverse irony. The Blackwoods saw themselves less as killers and more as artisans, elevating their atrocities to the level of cuisine. Their greatest gratification came not only from the act itself, but from serving those dishes to unsuspecting guests who praised the flavors without ever knowing what gave them their distinctive richness. For the Blackwoods, the recognition of excellence, even if rooted in horror, was the true reward. In modern criminal psychology, the Blackwood case is often cited as an extreme example of what specialists call functional delusion, a belief system completely detached from reality, yet capable of sustaining itself without collapsing under scrutiny. The Blackwoods' ability to maintain their respectable public image while committing atrocities in private reflects a level of compartmentalization so effective that it shielded them not only from the suspicion of their neighbors, but also from their own conscience. The Willow Creek story endures not because of ghosts or impossible folklore, but because it is horrifyingly plausible. Its power lies in reminding us that monsters do not always lurk in the shadows or hide under the bed. Sometimes they sit across from us at the dinner table smiling, as they offer hospitality that conceals a terrible secret. Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is what the case reveals about human vulnerability. Not just the physical vulnerability of lone travelers, but the psychological vulnerability of communities. The Blackwoods thrived not merely through force or trickery, but by exploiting the most fundamental social contracts, the trust between host and guest, between neighbors, and between those who prepare food and those who consume it. Professor Richardson captured this in his final reflections, discovered among his papers after his death. The true horror of the Blackwood case lies not in what they did to their victims' bodies, but in what they did to the social body, the community itself, by exploiting the most basic forms of human trust. They inflicted a wound that transcended individual suffering. Long after their disappearance, that wound festers in suspicion, paranoia, and the lingering question that haunts every traveler who accepts hospitality from a stranger. What am I really consuming, and at what cost? More than a century later, many questions remain unanswered. How many victims did the Blackwoods truly claim? Did they escape justice in Guatemala or Argentina? And perhaps most chilling of all, did their practices survive through descendants who carried their sacred knowledge into the present? Today, little remains of Willow Creek Inn. The clearing in Harlan County has been overtaken by forest young trees sprouting where the foundation once stood. The road that once carried travelers past its welcoming porch has long since been rerouted. Only the occasional historian or folklore enthusiast ventures into the woods, guided by old maps and whispered directions. Yet the story endures. In Cumberland and the surrounding hills, older residents still use the phrase Blackwood hospitality as shorthand for false kindness or hidden malice. And sometimes when a meal proves unusually rich and satisfying, someone will lean back half in jest and ask about the special ingredient. It's a grim joke, one that only makes sense to those who remember one of Kentucky's darkest, most disturbing unsolved cases.